Hey everyone, Xerath here, and today we have a very interesting and very controversial video topic. So this is going to be what is the best build on Xerath? And I know people are hearing that and they're already kind of cringing in their head, right? Because they're like, oh, well, the whole thing about League is it's like a fluid game, and like you have to build according to what your opponent's building and like what champions they have, and there's no one best build, and you shouldn't be building the best build every game. And I think that there's a lot of truth to that in League, but I saw something the other day. It was basically somebody asking on the Xerath subreddit, like, what is the build you can do that's like super solid every game, right? And will if you don't know what they're doing, or if you don't really know how to itemize, let's say you're a newer player or something like that, he wanted advice. And I think that there's there's application in giving somebody like a starter tool like that, but also I think that builds tend to be more solid than people like to admit. Like in our head, we like to think, oh, we're like build crafting every game, and we're kind of like, we're finding the optimal itemization in each case. But in reality, a lot of things are just good for very specific reasons, and it tends to be due to kind of like what you're trying to do on the champion specifically. So it's not always about just min-maxing the damage, for example, right? That's something where you could fine-tune that on a game-to-game basis and get sort of different results. But in a lot of cases, you may need to be preparing for certain things, or your build needs to be covering a certain like number of bases, right? And I think that's kind of what that guy was like hinting at with his post topic. So you do end up with these core builds, as you notice on a lot of champions, and I think sometimes, core components rather, but I think sometimes that can actually morph into a core build. And that's what I think I have here. I think this is the best build by far on Xerath overall, with maybe like a couple caveats. And we'll get into those first so you guys don't absolutely crucify me, right? So the first thing I want to talk about is defensive items. And as a support Xerath, like I mostly play the champion support, and you don't really have a ton of gold to go around to be buying a lot of defensive items, right? So if you're going to be buying one, you really need it really needs to be like absolutely necessary. And the one that really comes to mind, like the only one that I'll tend to like ever build, is Zanya's, right? I can't really go into all the matchups here and all the explicit reasons why you might want to buy Zanya's. It's kind of out of the scope of this video. I'll make another video on that specifically. But basically, I would say if you need to buy Zanya's, you need to buy it. Like if the game is unplayable for you without buying it, if you're being heavily focused by like really, really dive-happy champions and your team's not doing anything, you need to buy a little bit more time, you may just have to build that item. And you're going to have to deviate, obviously, from this build to do it, right? Another thing is heal cut. So heal cut is something where if your team is not building it and they have champions that, really have an insane amount of healing, then you basically need to build that or you lose. I think heal cut is very much overbuilt in the game in general. Even pros overbuild it. But that doesn't mean that some cases you don't need to build it, right? Like some games you will just be completely griefing yourself and your team if you do not at least build heal cut, especially because a lot of your teammates probably won't. So something to keep in mind there. So there are things that you're gonna have to deviate from this build path from. So you never want to be super locked in, but this is a very good build, I think, overall, that kind of deals with a lot of the problems in the game, and I'll kind of like talk about those in more detail as we get into the build. First, I just want to do some honorable mentions, and this is going to be a bit of a longer video, so I'll try and timestamp it, but stay with me for a bit here. And I think it's important to mention these honorable mentions because if we're kind of going through what to build, then we kind of also need to talk about like what not to build. But even though I'm going to be putting these in the not to build category, it doesn't mean you should never build them. Sometimes they do have some application, and I'll kind of go over that with each item, right? So the first item I want to talk about is Stormsurge. So this item is kind of reviled on this champion, I think. Like people hate this item. If you see it talked about in the subreddit, like it's kind of like something that a new player will look at and they'll be like, oh, that looks kind of good. And Xerath is burst, right? And then he'll post on the Xerath subreddit, like, is this a good item for Xerath? And people will like be like, no, that's terrible. And I kind of understand where they're coming from. a bit, but it's not for the reasons I think that they think that the item is bad. Like, I think a lot of people think this item is kind of bad for the wrong reasons. So the reason why I say that is a lot of people like to build Horizon Focus, right? So that's the item I'm going to kind of compare it to directly. And this item actually keeps up very well with Horizon Focus, even without the Squall effect. So I'm talking about even with the Hypershot effect active on Horizon Focus. And that's because you can see they have the same amount of AP, right? They don't have any other combat stats on this item, on Horizon Focus, but we have 10 magic penetration on Stormsurge. Now, that's actually insanely good, especially if you pair this with like a third item, Void Staff. So for example, if you built Luden's first item, and we're going to talk about item order and stuff later, and then you built Stormsurge, and then you built like a Void Staff, or you built Void Staff and then Stormsurge, at that point, you are actually penning like a squishy that has around like 40-something MR. I think that now the 80 carries go to like 40-something, or maybe possibly even close to 50, so you wouldn't be penning them to 0, but they would be almost 0, essentially, in the absolute late game at level 18. So depending on when you finish this 3-item core, they might actually be 0 MR. And if they're 0 MR, you are going to get basically the same or equivalent damage per shot as Horizon Focus on every ability, essentially, right? And then that's not even talking about the movement speed, which can sometimes be situationally useful, or Squall, right? So Squall is actually insane. It does a lot of damage. It gives a little bit of gold. But the other thing, too, is it has some interesting interactions. So, for example, if you build Squall with something like Liandry's Torment, what it can actually do is the damage will re-proc Liandry's, which is actually really cool. So Squall can give you quite a bit of damage on like a squishy target as long as you're able to actually proc it in the first place, right? So in situations where you can proc this, it's really good. And you might say, well, it's a 30-second cooldown on Squall, right? And it's like, that's true, but keep in mind, you are doing the same base damage basically as Horizon Focus, because on squishy targets, at least, right? Because, you're getting roughly the same value from the magic pen here, right? And obviously the item costs a little bit more, but you do have that chance of getting the really good proc, right? So that all sounds really good. So it's like, well, why wouldn't you build Stormsurge? And this is something we're going to cover. We'll talk about it a little bit here, but we'll cover it in depth later. It's basically something that I call future-proofing. And the main problem with building Stormsurge is if they decide to build like heavy MR, or they build like a really tanky Bruiser, now you have an item that is almost never going to proc Squall. And, it might proc Squall on like their AD carry or something, but sometimes that's not even the target you need to be killing, right? So it kind of depends. And if they're really tanky and you can't proc Squall reliably, you want to be able to proc it like from your Q or maybe a couple shots from your R, right? And if you can't do that, it's really hard to get good value out of it. And if they're really tanky, even comboing their tank may not, because sometimes you can combo a tank that's in the front line very easily if they're immobile, right? But even comboing their tank may not proc Squall. So it basically just comes down to they can kind of outbuild this item, right? And if you're not absolutely sure how they're going to build, maybe if the team was like super squishy, I could see buying this item, right? Like super squishy, and they're not going to itemize heavily defensively. But the moment they do, it hurts this item so much. And it's not necessarily because the item itself is bad, it's just because now you have dumped 2,900 gold into something where you don't have the other, you don't have any other, like it doesn't serve a functional purpose now, right? Because its purpose is essentially killing squishy stuff. And you're now missing an item that would serve the purpose of killing the tanks, basically. So that's my my little spiel on Stormsurge, right? And then Shadowflame. Okay, so Shadowflame is this is an interesting item, and I think that people like this item in their mind because it's kind of like in a way similar, in my opinion, to Stormsurge, really, because it has a lot of AP, right? It has even more AP, costs more obviously, and it has more magic penetration. Right, so on its base, it actually does like really comparable damage. Like, it'll out damage Horizon Focus in a lot of cases, at least. Again, unless it's like a super tanky target, etc. And so it does really good damage in that sense. But the like, a lot of what you're paying for here is obviously the Cinderbloom passive, and getting use out of that, I feel like, can be very tricky on Xerath, because people in their head, they build this item and they think like, okay, well, the idea is I'm going to be executing like squishy low health champions with this with my ult, right? But in reality, I feel like I tend to prefer using my ult to I tend to prefer using my ult to start fights, kind of, right? And you know, like, my jungler and team have kind of like trapped people, or they're pushing into people. I pop my R, I kind of cut off their escape from behind, force them to either go back and eat shots or come in and eat shots while they're fighting with my team, right? So a lot of my damage with R especially is going to be coming out earlier in the fight. And a lot of your poke in general in the game is going to be coming out on people that are full health, right? A lot of times you're going to be in the mid game, you're going to be around the dragon area, right? Just kind of turreting up, shooting people, chucking them out. And a lot of times, like, if they get low, they're actually going to have to leave in base, right? They're not going to sit around for you to finish them off with something like Shadowflame. So I think getting a lot of the benefit out of the Cinderbloom passive is tough. Even in cases where you are getting benefit from it, I think sometimes it can be a bit redundant, right? So if I'm have an Udyr on my team and he's like chasing somebody down and I hit an ult shot, right, when they're kind of low, does it really matter if my ult shot killed that person? Probably not, right? Because Udyr is just going to finish him off anyway in a lot of cases, right? There's going to be very few cases where, like, we need the extra damage on the execute from me to, like, finish somebody. So I think it's a very situational item. Again, this is something that's you know, better into squishy teams, but the real problem is kind of the same problem that Stormsurge has, where now if they do get really tanky, right, you're just missing other items that can deal with the tank situation. So it's not so much that the item is bad intrinsically, it's just what is their team gonna look like, and they can outscale this item where they can't outscale certain other items, right? Think of it like that. So Horizon Focus, the last item. Now we are going to be building this a little bit today, because we're going to do two versions of builds to kind of like compare things for you. But this is an interesting item because it's very cheap, right? It does good damage for how cheap it is. And the Hypershot effect can be very useful, right? Because sometimes, you know, getting that tag on somebody is critically important, because when you're trying to finish them off with R or something, if you don't have sight of them, if they disappear into vision, let's say, like they're over here, you know, you have to use your ult to your first couple shots to find them, basically, right? And then you can kind of key in on them and kind of readjust your aim for where you think they're going to be. You don't have to do that with Hypershot, right? Because you have vision on them. So that makes things a lot easier, obviously, and it has really good utility in that aspect. But again, it just suffers from that same problem in that if they do get really tanky, this item is just now not the best item. And this may be a support perspective in particular, but with me having limited gold on the support role, I really need every item to count, right? I can't afford to be taking items that don't have a use throughout the entire game, really. So that's kind of like what you're going to see with this build. And I think like why it's so good, right? So you'll notice we have the build here, right? And I kind of want to I'll briefly kind of go over the philosophy of it, and then I'll kind of go through each item individually. And the idea here is basically to have a build where they cannot outscale the champion, right? So every component of this build has a specific purpose, and it's actually probably better if we just go through it one by one, right? And I'll explain like what each item's functional role is in the build. And then I'll talk about some misconceptions some of the items have after that. So obviously we have boots to start, right? And this isn't the build order. We'll go into the build order in the end. So don't think this is like how we're building things necessarily first. But so Sorc Shoes, you need boots basically. The only time I play without boots is like in the very, very late game. What I typically have for my build on support is I'll have a support item. I'll have a fully stacked Dark Seal / Magi is here, right? and then I'll sell my boots for a Rabadon's. And at that point, you go to like 900 AP. Rabadon's is a huge spike at that point when you have something like a Magi's. It's kind of crazy. So, yeah, it just gets like really strong. And in the very late game, your ult is like super powerful, right? So you can be relatively safe from long range. It's super good at helping create picks with your team, right? So you don't need the movement speed necessarily as much late game. I mean, certain scenarios you might, so you can't always sell your boots. It is a dependent situation, you know. You kind of have to read the game state. But that's kind of like the only scenario where I'll play without boots is like in the hyper late game, right? Yeah, so we definitely need the boots and we need damage on them. So we go Sorcs. And then Luden's Companion. So in my opinion, you need a mana item. And I prefer this over Malignance. I have a whole video comparing these two. And so you can refer to that if you want the down low on that. And why do you need a mana item? Well, if you're not in lane and you don't have like minions close to you or jungle camps or whatever in a fight, and you can't like safely auto their frontline tank or something like that, it's possible to actually run sometimes in this champion. Like there can be situations where you're trying to like siege around Baron or something, and there's no jungle camps up, and it's just too dangerous to really get close, right? So having that extra mana buffer is really nice. And the extra mana does help with something like Mana Flow Band, because once you max this out and you get 1% of your missing mana per 5 seconds, then obviously you're getting more mana the more max mana pool you have, right? So I always like to at least build one mana item. And this is not a terrible item, obviously, for damage. It does good burst, and it's going to do even better burst next patch, so it'll be a better buy then. And then look at Void Staff. So Void Staff is obviously, here to take out magic penetration. Now, penning magic resistance is one of your best sources of damage, and they buffed this item to give it like more AP, right? I think it was like 60 AP or something before, so now it has like a reasonable amount of AP as well, and a healthy dose of magic pen. So yeah, this is just like a staple item. You typically want some type of magic penetration, because that's always going to help buff your damage essentially. And we're kind of we're gonna go back to this in one moment after we talk about Liandry's. We're kind of gonna talk about these together. So Liandry's, the purpose of this is obviously tank shred, right? And we're gonna talk about why you're even hitting tanks later on. But for right now, just know the purpose of this item is tank shred, and it's not just tank shred though. It's that a lot of things in this game get mildly tanky, and the damage of Liandry's on them is like very respectable. And in a fight situation where you're getting all your abilities off, it's very easy to keep suffering up at least some of the time, right? Especially because the ticks also keep suffering up, right? So you're getting even more damage than you think with this item essentially than when you first look at it. So this is just a very good item. And this is where I'm kind of going to go into the misconceptions part, right, about items in this build with the Void Staff and Liandry's Torment. So people think of Void Staff and they think like, okay, you build this item when the enemy is building large amounts of MR, right? And obviously that is when the item gets most value, okay? There's no debating that, right? It's just obvious. But what people don't realize is that you actually do like very similar damage just penning magic penetration, as opposed to like other things. Like for example, this item will do very similar damage to something like Horizon Focus. It actually out damages Horizon Focus on squishy targets. Okay, it'll do similar damage to Shadowflame on squishy targets unless they are in the 35% threshold, right? Because what's basically happening here is when you have Void Staff on like an 80 carry type squishy target, and then you have the Sorc Pen boots, they're going down to I think about 9 MR. So you're removing a huge chunk of that MR from them, and it's going to increase your damage versus them by like a large portion. And we're going to compare this directly to, like I said, Horizon Focus. We actually do the testing, which is a popular item that people really like to build, right? So this item just is good in general. Like it's almost never a bad item, because there's really no way, especially in the game now, for you to pen all of the resistances of a target without it. Aside from doing a build that's like maybe Shadowflame, Boots, and Stormsurge, that'll mostly pen all the resistance on a very squishy target, but you're very SOL at that point for tankier targets. Your build does nothing to tanky targets at that point, right? Targets who stack MR or targets who stack health. So you can go that option if you're trying to do like really squishy, if you're trying to really abuse a squishy team. But outside of that, Void Staff kind of does the same thing, and it gives you more flexibility because now you've already built this, so even if they start itemizing into heavier MR, you have the answer for it already, and we're going to talk about that a little bit later. Liandry's is sort of the same thing. People have this idea that this item is an anti-tank item exclusively, and when you do damage against squishies with this item, that you don't do good damage. That's not really the case. Both these items will outdamage Horizon Focus. It's just that they're not the most gold efficient for doing damage to squishier targets, right? So in an absolute sense, you're never losing anything on a squishy target by building them. It's just that you're not doing the most efficient gold per damage done, right, to the squishy target by building them. Think of it that way. And that's what we're going to demonstrate in this video right here, is that, these are not items that can't be bought against squishy targets, right? It's just that if the entire team is squishy, there'd be no reason to buy them. But that's almost never the case in the game, which is kind of going to be the last thing I'm going to talk about before we actually get into the test, which is that post durability patch and, just kind of like the meta of this game in general, bruisers are so common. And there's things that act like bruisers that you wouldn't even think act like bruisers. Like, people don't really consider Kayn a bruiser. They consider him a fighter. A lot of times he's going to build with some amount of health. Riven's going to build with some amount of health. Aurelion Soul, champions like that in mid, they build a lot of health. They're not typically thought of as like bruisers or something like that, right? Even champions like Zed or something, they have higher than base MR, right? Their MR, a lot of people don't realize this, but their MR is different from the MR of an AD carry. Champions like Yasuo, his MR is different from that of an AD carry. So you have all these champions that kind of like, they seem like they might be kind of squishy champions, and they kind of are unless you build them, somewhat tanky, but they're not as squishy as like in AD or something. There's very few champions now in the game that are like as squishy as like a pure AD carry or like a really squishy pure support like Sona or something like that, right? A lot of the champions you're going to be fighting either have some type of augmentation to their armor or MR, or their base health is higher than usual, or their build path incorporates a lot of health in it, right? So it's just very, very easy to get a lot of value out of something like Liandry's Torment in the current state of the game. And in terms of MR and stuff like that, it's very common, especially if you're doing really well, to have somebody itemize at least a little bit of MR against you. Build something like a Maw, build something like a Wit's End, and you do very pitiful damage against a Wit's End if you do not have a Void Staff. Let me tell you. I know by experience, trust me. So, yeah, that's kind of like the thought process of the build and where we're going with this, and now we're going to demonstrate it live. So we get the dummies here, right? And what do these represent? So the idea is this is going to be like mid-game, and we're going to start with a 2-item demonstration, and then we're going to move to, I'm actually going to sell this right now. Yeah, and then we're going to move to a 3-item demonstration. And these are meant to be around like, level 13 AD carry, level 15 jungler, stuff like that, right? So this is going to be your AD carry. He's got 40 MR and around 1700 health at that level. He's probably got like a scaling health rune or something like that, right? This is going to be something like, think of this as like a jungle Kayn or something like that. He's got 60 MR around this level and 2500 health, like around level 15 or something. This is going to be that same bruiser type, and he's going to have bought an MR item. So think of this as like a Kayn that has bought, or like let's say it's a Riven that bought like a Maw or something, right? She's realized you're getting a little bit fed, and she wants to be a little bit more durable versus you. And this is going to be like your super tank. Now, I know this is like, this is not even close to like what a super tank can be, right? You can have 250 plus MR, 4k plus health. But the reason why we didn't add a 5th dummy or go crazy on this dummy is because there's just not really a need to, because the point of this test is mostly going to be focusing on these 3. We're going to have this in, just for comparison's sake, but obviously once you start getting into these types of magic resist and health, it's just obvious that items like Void Staff and Liandry's Torment are insane, right? So I don't really need to prove that to you here by having a 5k HP, 300 MR dummy, right, where we're going to show the best case scenario for our items. I want to show you how the items perform in the worst case scenario, right? And the idea is, therefore, if you have some of these super tanks on the enemy team, right, and maybe like you have a super tank, like a Bruiser or a couple Bruisers, and then you have some squishy targets, you'll see why this build is so good against a team like that, and that's going to be against the majority of the teams you face, right? So, yeah, we'll just we'll get things started, and we'll start on the low target right here on the AD carry. Okay, so 591. Okay, that's with our Liandry's Torment, and we will sell this. Okay, we'll buy this just to kind of show. We'll wait for our stuff to come back up. The reason why I opted to still go first strike and stuff is I just want you to have a good in-game, like, I want this to be as close to in-game as possible, right? So I don't want to, like, not have the runes in and stuff like that, so I'll shoot this again. There's like 591, right? Okay, so as you can see, like, the Liandry's is really good, right? It actually outdamages even the Void here. And then we're going to sell this, and just going to wait for everything to cool down. Okay, make sure we're at max range. And you see, like, we're not even touching, like, so this doesn't even do the damage of, let alone the Liandry, it doesn't do the damage of the Void Staff even on second item, right? And keep in mind how the Hypershot works is it does apply on the first Q hit. People don't realize that about this item. They think that you have to hit them, and then then the damage starts applying, the extra damage. That's not how it works. It applies in the first hit. So we'll sell this, and we'll actually toss in this just for the giggles here, right? And you'll see. So you notice that's a pretty good chunk of damage, right? And it outdamaged our Horizon Focus, and it outdamaged our Void Staff at this magic resist level, but it didn't even outdamage our Torment. We'll shoot this one more time just to kind of like to prove here. Yeah, so it didn't actually outdamage Torment, but it got close, right? Keep in mind that item does cost more though, right? So, and then now we will we'll do this comparison on these other things, and then we'll go into 3 items is what we'll do. So shoot this target. Now remember, this is the standard Bruiser. Standard Bruiser. Now basically the way you should be thinking of this is kind of like the worst case scenario for the Void and the Liandry's Torment. Everything now you should be getting more value, right? And this will be more apparent when we get to 3 items. But yeah, so we'll sell this. Void Staff, right? So 546. 502. Okay. And then I just want to double check that one really quick. I think we're fine. Yeah, 502. Okay. And then so 546, 502, and then Just gonna wait on our first strike. $470, as you can see. So that's very weak. I'm gonna hit that one more time just to make sure we got it from max range. But you can see 546 versus 570, right? Huge damage differential. And then it even loses to the Void Staff at 502, which is kind of expected to lose to the Void Staff, but a lot of people wouldn't expect it to lose to the Liandrys. This actually doesn't, this isn't for the damage, this is just for the focus aspect of it, but I don't want to confuse people in the video, so. Yeah, see? 470, so it was correct, just to double check on that. So, very weak damage there coming out of Horizon Focus. So if you're building this, it's really, in my opinion, for the ability haste, or really, the ability haste is in most cases not going to be the most consequential thing. So it's really going to be for the reveal if you're building this, personally, in my opinion. Which, in my opinion, the reveal is good. It's just that, like, you know, if you have to build now, if they get tanky and you have to build the tank shredding items, then you're just not going to have the gold for it, right? And we'll do this, right, just to see. $487. Okay, so that is less than the Void Staff and the Liandrys, keep in mind. So that's really, really tough. So we'll kind of go to the next target here. We'll just keep things in order, right? We'll go back to Liandrys first. So this is with the MR. This is the MR Bruiser, basically. Okay, so 404. Not bad. And now we'll sell this. We'll pick up the Void Staff. $404. 400. Right, so as we increase the MR, right, we start to see a little bit more value out of the Void Staff. Now, I would say about this, it tends to be rare that they build the item at this point in the game, and this is why when we talk about the build order, you'll see that I tend to build the Liandry second, because I feel like they tend to build the health before they build the MR. But you could obviously adjust the build depending on what you see. You know, if they're really, really going heavily into MR from the very start for some reason, you could always make the swap here, right? You don't have to do this as something that's set in stone. But I'm just telling you what I normally see in the order things are built in the game, right? So we'll put on the Horizon Focus. $347, right? So quite weak. Now, to be completely fair to this item, right, it does cost less, and I want to stress that because I don't want this to come off like it's an unfair comparison. But the thing you have to realize is that it's not great that it's doing less damage in these scenarios, because, like, the other items are just going to do better against even the harder and harder opponents, right? So it's like, yeah, we're not necessarily expecting that it do, like, super great damage here, but the problem is that building this, if they do go that tanky route, you know, now we just have kind of like a dead item. So we're going to sell this, and we'll go this at 47. Curious to see what this is actually going to bring us, if it's more or less. Okay, so a little bit more, but still not, probably not 500 gold worth more, right? So, very weak items there against these types of targets. So, this is the super tank, right? So, $354, okay. And then we will sell this. We'll pick up the Void Staff. And we're good. Okay, so these are, like, they're similar, right, on the super tank, which, you know, kind of makes sense at this point, because both the MR and the health are high. And then we'll sell this. We go into Horizon Focus, just waiting on the first strike. 288. That is tragic, as you guys can see. Right, and then we will sell this. And we'll go into here, and I think that we'll actually get even less damage. Oh, about the same. Okay, 288. So interesting. But yeah. So items don't do too great on there. So now we're going to start the 3-item comparison. Okay, so we're going to sell this. We're going to go back to our thing. And this is going to be like the premier build, essentially. And something with this build, I'll cover it right now. You can build Cryptbloom instead of this if you want. Like if you want the additional, the additional ability haste, go ahead and build it. Or if you think that the passive is going to be really valuable in a particular game, or to help you get assists or whatever for a Dark Seal, it's absolutely fine. You're going to do a little bit less damage, obviously, on these tankier targets, but I think just having an item that gives some amount of magic pen is really the thing that you're going to want in most of these games, right? Because inevitably, people are going to itemize some type of MR, or you're going to be playing against champions with relatively high base MR. So you want some amount of percentage pen. It's just a matter of whether you prefer that to be the Cryptbloom or the Void Staff. Obviously, I'll do a little bit more raw damage with Void, but... Okay, so we're going to be shooting this target right here with our build. This is the 80 carry, remember? So 759. Huge damage on the 80 carry. Now, again, we're going to sell this, right? Or, sorry, we're going to... sell the Liandrys, right? 759. $715. Okay. And I think the other one I kind of want to do here is I want to do, this is going to be another common build against the squishies, so we'll do, remember it was 759, 715, and then we're going to sell the Void Staff, and we're going to go Shadowflame, right? So this should be more damage than the second one, I believe. 759, 715... Yeah, 731, but keep in mind, it still does not do the damage of the Liandry, right? It still does not do the damage of the Liandry by a decent margin. The only time you would get more damage out of this, right, is obviously if you're rapid firing abilities at the target. For any type of poking scenario, which Xerath is going to be doing a lot of, and a lot of your damage comes from, as long as you get a reasonable amount of ticks on the Liandry, you are doing more damage with the Liandry, right? So, and keep in mind, this is a poke-based champion, right? So we're heavily leaning into the poke idea here. So, yeah, so we're gonna, we pretty much did this one to death, right? And we're gonna go back, and we're gonna sell this, and we're gonna go on to the next target here. So... Okay, so 727 onto the Bruiser target. Alright, we're going to sell this. And we'll go Horizon Focus. I'll wait for everything to come up.
The secrets of magic are mine alone.
652. We're actually going to hit that again, just to make sure, okay? Because you can see that the difference is already staggering, right, at this point. But I want to show you, like, I don't want you guys to think this is like a rigged test or anything, so we'll double check it. But, and we'll even wait for this, even though, like I said, this is for the focus portion of the ability. Okay.
Emotions are only distractions.
Okay, I actually think we may not have been in range, so we'll do one more. I shouldn't have. I don't know, kind of messed up there. I think it did a little bit less damage. Sorry about that. This is actually just showing like a weakness of the item itself, though. To be honest, like if anything. Okay. Yeah. Oh, so we were in range 642. Yeah. So kind of like incredibly weak in comparison there, and then you know we'll swap this out for this, right? 652. And even less damage, right? And we'll go back to like the main build just to kind of to show you. And this is doing this damage from any range, by the way. 702 to that target. Insane damage differential, as you can see, right? Not even close. And then we will... So we'll apply it on this, basically. Okay. This is the MR Bruiser, keep in mind, right? So 579. Okay, so we will sell this. No, sorry, we'll sell this for the Horizon Focus, right? Huge damage differential, 579 to 512. And then we're doing the Squishy Eater build, right? Which is this. 579, 512. We'll wait for the hyper shot just to abate the fears of people watching. And we do a very low amount of damage, as you can see, right? In comparison to the other things. So we will sell this, and we will go to the third target. We could test, like, there's like one more configuration we could test with the, we could do like this, Void Staff and then Shadowflame, but it's a very similar type of build essentially, right? We can actually do that in some of the targets if we want, just to we'll do that like last maybe. Okay, and we'll just compare it to our main build is what we'll do on that one. Okay, so we'll shoot this target first. Remember, this is the primary build, 504, right? And sell this.
I stand at the brink of infinity.
Okay, so 441, substantial damage decrease there. And then if we sell this for the Shadowflame, just remember 504 and 441. I'll actually do it with this up to make sure, so you guys don't worry about that. But it's gonna be the same damage value, you'll see. So 504. And then it's like 451, something like that, 441. Okay. Yeah, 365. So huge damage drop here. And what we'll do is we'll do the comparison between the main build and this other build with this is going to get swapped out for a Void Staff. Okay. So what we'll do is we'll kind of do it on each one of these. So this is the squishiest target, right? So that's 716. Okay. And we will sell this for this. And we'll wait for first strike to come up. So 716. And 759. So still pretty good damage on the other version, right? But unless you're getting that Cinderbloom effect, it's just not worth it, right? And then we'll hit this target again. What does it say? You pause and enable use pause. Okay, maybe I'll just pause it in a second then. Okay, so 702. Okay, that's with this. And then we'll swap this out. Okay, see, still a little bit less damage. Wait for first strike again. $579. Just wait for it one more time here. See, still significantly less damage. And then let's let this do one more. So 526. We'll let this come back up one more time and then we're done. Let's talk about some other things to end the video. 526 and 447. So yeah, obvious disparities on the ladder dummies, but as you can see, even on the dummy where things should be closer, they're not really that close, right? It was still a 759 versus like a 714. So I'm gonna pause this. Okay. And that'll allow us to just keep talking in general, because I don't want this to close out and then close out my shadow play. Okay, so we did all the testing, right? And you can clearly see just like how good the build is, even on squishier targets. It's still the highest performing build even on squishy targets. Again, not necessarily per gold spent, but still like in a raw sense the most. So anytime you have a mix of like, you know, relatively squishy targets with tanky targets, or even moderately tanky targets with the bruisers, this is kind of like the way to go, right? But we want to cover a couple other things in the build. So Dark Seal. Where does Dark Seal factor into this, right? So usually I will always build Dark Seal. I think it's just really good value on this champion. For sure, it's never, in my opinion, really bad to build. The question is, when do you build it, right? And we can also talk about the build order of the build in general, right? So I'm not super concerned personally with missing a few stacks of my Dark Seal early. And I would describe it as I'm willing to trade raw damage early for a potential couple stacks of my Dark Seal. So I'd rather get the kills by having a bit more damage and not have the seal to stack them onto than to have the seal and maybe get like less kills, but now we have a couple stacks in the seal or something like that. And I think the reason for that is kills in the early game can just be really huge, right? They can get you plates, they can get you an objective, like grubs or dragon or something like that. They just get you pressure overall. It could be like honestly even a psychological edge versus the opponent. They're kind of angry that you killed them first or something like that, right? So I prefer to have the kills early on because especially too because the champion is weakest early in my opinion. So I generally try and do things that are going to compensate for that weakness as opposed to fully build in to the late game, right? Like in my eyes, it doesn't really matter if I'm down like 2 or 3 stacks on a Dark Seal. If our team is up kills, up gold because we were able to convert something off of those kills. It's not, when I use the term kills, it's not just about getting the raw kills. It's about what you can convert off of them, right? And you're not always going to be able to convert off of them, but in the cases where you can, it's way better that you got the kill, right? Because you had a little bit more damage. So what that tends to mean is I will build, I'll build a mana crystal when I go back for a little bit of extra help of sustaining mana in the lane, and also that helps with something like Mana Flow Band as well because it's giving you more max mana, right? So you're getting a little bit more regen, and then after that I will try and build 2 books into a Hextech alternator, right? And that's actually the first part of the Ludens I build. Because for me, I think that especially with the change to the support item, where now you're not penalized for not hitting the enemy laners as much, right? Because you can actually just, you can basically use it like an old Targon shield, right? You can hit the minions and proc your support item, or you can hit them. And what that means is you can save your really juicy damage. So you're like your first strike, or if you're using Comet or something like that, like you can save that to hit the opponent, right? So you don't have to be spamming abilities out on them in lane necessarily to do reasonable amounts of damage. In fact, because of how high the cost of Xerath's abilities are, a lot of times I prefer making sure I kind of have things up before I hit them, right? So I'll have my alternator up, I'll have my first strike up, or if I'm playing Comet, I'll have Comet up, and it's just more mana efficient damage that way, right? So I really like the alternator. It's not necessarily just about the lane, though. It's kind of about having the alternator when like an early fight breaks out around Dragon or something. It's just really good. You feel like you're contributing much more meaningful damage. And something that I'll kind of get into with the Ludens as well, actually I can just talk about now, is I feel like the proc-based things make you a bit scarier than you are, which is kind of good in a sense, because the opponents won't always realize that, right? So it's kind of like if you hit them with a 6-shot charge on Luden's Companion, they're not thinking in their head like, oh, well, that's down for 12 seconds. You know, they're just like, oh, wow, that Q really hurt, and they kind of back off. And it's kind of like the same thing with Alternator, right? Like, they respect the fact that they just took a big hit, and in their mind, they're kind of thinking the worst case scenario of, I'm going to get hit like that again. They may not even realize that you already have Alternator, right? Especially because a lot of people just don't check items in this game. So you can kind of get away with stuff like that, right? And yeah, so typically what I would do is I'd try and build the alternator, and then I would build the Dark Seal after. Sometimes, depending on if the alternator actually led to kills, then what would happen is I might finish my boots first. So I go magical boots typically. I just have these runes so that it didn't have to wait the amount of time in game, obviously, to to get the boots or whatever, to when I was setting everything up. So I usually go magical boots, and sometimes I'll finish the pen boots because, again, that's like another power spike, right? The alternator, the pen boots, finishing the actual Ludens, those are all power spikes. So my methodology is to kind of like, I'll take a power spike when it's available, and if it's not available, I'll build the Dark Seal, kind of like in the early game, right? And yeah, if I finish the Luden's Companion as well as the boots, then I always build Dark Seal next, because at that point I'm probably ahead and I really do want to start stacking the seal and I'm probably in a good position to stack the seal, right? Because I'm just doing more damage now. So that's kind of how I handle that. Is there ever a situation where I don't build Darksteel? Basically, only if I know that I'm going to have to build the healing orb item, right? Like if I know I'm going to have to build that, then I actually tend to opt not to go Darksteel and just go healing orb instead, when I'm on support at least. Because the problem you run into on support is that it's kind of like twofold. The first one is that you don't want to have too many components and not be building into items, right? So spending 350 gold on an item that you're not really going to upgrade, and you may or may not get stacks on, is fine in and of itself. But when you need to build another component item, right, now you have two component items that aren't really finishing into anything. They're not really accomplishing any of our goals, right? Remember, our goals are we need to secure our mana with the Ludens. We need to secure our penetration with the Void Staff, and then this should be a Liandry's, right? Obviously, we're doing the testing, but we want to have some form of HP shred, right? So the healing orb and the dark seal are not really contributing to either of that, right? And the dark seal is the thing that is contributing towards nothing, because at least the healing orb is contributing towards limiting their healing, which is obviously the reason why you build it, and you would only build it in a case where you felt you really need it, right? Where the dark seal is just contributing raw AP damage, which we can kind of always get later on if we really need to or something like that, right? It's not doing anything unique for us. And it's contingent on us never dying, which is sometimes suspect, right? So that's the item that I would always trade off to go healing orb, because remember, you're gonna have your support item here, right? So if I have a dark seal, I no longer have spot for my full build, and then so what it would look like if I go healing item is it would be Luden's Companion. This right here, Void Staff, Liandry's support item, and then eventually upgrade the orb into a Merlinomicon as like the last purchase, basically, right? That's kind of what I do there. So that's the only reason. That's the only scenario where I don't pick up Dark Seal, I would say. And so when would I upgrade Dark Seal, right? This is another good question. That is probably going to come up in the build. So typically, I do not upgrade Dark Seal for a while until the very end of the game. Now, if you're the type of person that just wants to do this, you like the idea of flexing with the 25 stack Magi's, I'm not going to try and advise you against it. People do what they want to do, but here's my thought process, right? Is let's say there have been some games where I finished my companion and I have a 10 stack Dark Seal, right? And if I upgrade it here, right, I'm spending 1,150 gold to gain virtually no AP, and we're not progressing towards any of our other goals. Our goals being make sure we shore up our penetration and make sure we have some type of way to deal with somewhat tankier champions. So we're not accomplishing either of those goals, and we're barely gaining any AP, and now if we die, we basically lose all of our investment, right? Not permanently necessarily, because we can gain it back, but it's just not a very gold efficient purchase at the time, right? So typically when I would build it is when I have my Luden's Companion, I have my Void Staff, and then I have my Liandry's, right? I have my support item, and then I have a 10 stack Dark Seal, and then I'll build it into a Magi's, and then eventually I'll sell my boots for a Rabadon's if things are going well. I'll have a 25 stack Magi's, we'll have around 900 AP, and it'll be very, very strong. So that's kind of what I'll do there, but yeah, so I tend to upgrade the Magi's very late. And another thing is this kind of goes into the future-proofing argument, right? Where if you spend the 1,150 gold early to upgrade the Magi's, now you're just behind on all that future-proofing you're trying to do, right? So if they do build like something like a Negatron Cloak, right? Like if I am in this scenario where I have the 10 stack Dark Seal and I have a Luden's Companion, then I upgrade the Dark Seal. and then their jungler in their top lane buy a Negatron Cloak or the other item, Null Magic Mantle, I just do no damage now. And now it's going to be even harder for me to get the kills to justify increasing the Magi stacks, right? Like, we may go numbers of fights where you don't even increase that number of stacks by that much, right? Because you just have these super tanky champions that are durable throughout the fights, they're getting away, etc. So, yeah, I really don't like being in a situation where they're just able to drop that cloak, that Negatron cloak on me and completely destroy me. So I'm always trying to work towards the core build, right? And typically, the MR becomes more of a problem than the health, right? Because you kind of know when a champion is going to have a lot of health, right? Something that builds like Heartsteel, like a Cho'Gath or something, or their HP, their build path is just a ton of HP. But the one that's more deceptive is the MR, because at any given time, a lot of champions have access to something like an AP champion can just build a BV, a fighter champion can just build a Maw, a lot of AD carries can just build a Wits, right? So at any point, they can just kind of throw you off and build that MR item. And if you're not already working towards just think of how bad that would feel, right? So it's like, now you don't even have to just finish the Liandry, right? You have to build a Void Staff on top of that, and you haven't even started the Liandry yet because you spent 1,100 gold on upgrading your Magi's. So, yeah, that's the big thing for me. And, yeah, that's how I would deal with like, that problem. And kind of like the final thing I want to talk about in this video, I think, is people would say, like, why are we so worried about doing damage to tankier champions, right? Your goal is to kill squishy champions. So just focus on that and be the best you can be at that. And I think that's something that, kind of like in the last video, where we're talking about the Luden's Companion versus Malignance, right? People will say, well, your ult's really good, so why would you not just want to build into your ult? You're going to get more ults per game. You're going to have the ult at crucial times you wouldn't with the other build. All that stuff sounds really good on paper, right? But something sounding good on paper is different from it being effective in game. And the reality is, in game, you're just not always going to be able to shoot the squishy champions, right? So, like, you are going to have to take what they can give you. In a lot of cases, yeah, you're going to be trying to hit the squishies when you can. But there's no reason to not shoot the front line in between. And you can see some of the massive differences in damage values we're getting when we have, like, the really squishy-centered build, right, versus the build that can actually do some damage to tanks, right? And imagine hitting that tank for, like, 100 and some extra damage each time or something, right? Like, that adds up over the course, because your Q is only, like, a 3-point-something second cooldown. Sometimes you can toss some W's in there, especially on the tanks, right, because they can't get to you as easy, so you're still safe enough to cast W. So you can actually put a lot of damage down on tanks and really soften them up, right? Or bruisers or anything like that. And you really just want to be taking every opportunity you can to deal damage, because you never know when that little bit of damage you dealt can make a difference, right? That's how I play Xerath, is I'm just trying to do as much chip as possible and, like, to help out my teammates when the actual final time comes to do damage, right? You want to look at this champion as, like, you want to terrorize them. Like, every moment they are on your screen, you want to be roasting them alive, and that includes tanks. Obviously, the best targets to target are the squishier, crucial targets if you can hit them. And you will be hitting them, like, certainly at various points. But like I said, this build still does great damage to them. It actually does more damage to them than a lot of the squishy builds, unless everything lines up, like the squishy target's low, and you have a Shadowflame, etc., right? So even in most circumstances, this build out-damages the squishy target builds on the squishy targets, right? While also dealing way better damage to tankier targets in the front line, and allowing you to apply pressure there, like forcing them back. So it's not like if you have an Udyr that's fighting against, like a Xerath that's built into Horizon Focus and Shadowflame, and he's got, like, a decent MR item, he's not giving a care in the world about walking like into your team. You know what I mean? But if I have a Void Staff and a Liandry, and he's not like a super tank, he's taking some chip damage. You know what I mean? Like, he obviously still has a trump card he can pull with his Empowered W, but he can't just walk in there for free and not take any damage and then have that cooldown to rely back on, right? He is now having to think about using that way earlier because I'm actually doing relevant damage to him. And that's kind of like what a lot of this is about. It's about keeping the other champions in the game honest, not allowing them to do things that they just shouldn't be able to do, right? Like walk all over your team. You have to keep them honest, and the way you keep them honest is doing damage. You can't provide a lot of utility if you're playing this character support like other supports can, you know? So your utility is sort of like forcing them and keeping them honest, not allowing them to do these ridiculous things like walking into your team, just walking all over people on your team. And the way you do that is by doing respectable enough damage to them to shoo them out, essentially, right? So yeah, that is why I am like very much a proponent of your build should absolutely cover doing damage to tanks if there are tanky champions in the game. And, you know, I would never say that this is like the optimal build against a super squishy team that is not going to build like any amount of tankiness at all. But the reality is, in almost every game you play of League of Legends today, post durability patch, people are playing stuff that is at least moderately tanky. There's so many tank supports you see. There's so many bruisers you see. A lot of the mid laners are sort of like bruisers. We now have 2 options for skilling health runes, right, that some people are leaning into. The support item gives it base 200 HP, right? So even the squishier support champions are tankier than they normally would be, especially if they also build into the double skilling health or whatever, right? Which a lot of them probably do because they don't care about getting like 9 additional AP or something like that, right? So there's just a lot of sources of kind of like tankiness or pseudo tankiness in the game right now, and particularly HP. And Liandry's deals with those incredibly well, and Void Staff deals with the worst end of the MR, as well as it still penetrates a good amount to bring you very close to 0 on the squishy champions, right? So it's just, yeah, like it's all around just incredibly good items. And like I said, depending on what you need to build with defensive items and stuff, you may not be able to build them every game. You know, some games you need to build the healing orb item, but in the games that you can get away with like a solid build like this is like the build that's going to accelerate you the fastest. It's going to allow you to do damage to everything on the map, and it's going to give you the best chance to win, in my opinion. So thank you for coming to my TED Talk. Sorry this was a bit long, but I hope this gave you a different perspective. Hopefully change some, you know, thoughts you may have had if you thought that, like, you know, Liandry's does really bad damage against squishies or something like that, or Void Staff does really bad damage against squishies. They don't, right? So if you came away with that, I'm happy. Even if you're not into the build, that's completely fine. As long as you kind of got a little bit more perspective about items, or maybe sometimes they're a little bit more useful outside of the situations that we think they would be useful in, right? And that's the main thing to take away from this. And then with that, you can kind of start thinking about your own builds and your own games and stuff, even if you don't want to do this build. So thank you guys for watching. If you learned something and you like this, feel free to like, comment, and subscribe. Again, I appreciate you guys, and until next time, yeah, just have a good time out there and try out the build. See you guys next time.